Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, everything I read in April. So April was a really enjoyable reading month for me. I had a really good time. I took part in 3 fantastic events. So Old School April, which is a nostalgic readathon and watchathon created by Kelsey from the channel Slime and Slashers. Trans Girl April, which is a readathon dedicated to reading books by trans and non-binary authors created by Say Kevy. And Giant April, which is a readathon dedicated to reading books about giant apes and other giant creatures, which was created by Roy from the channel Roy Reads Anything. So yeah, a really fun month, and I read a lot as well. So I read 30 books this month, albeit quite a lot of those books are like super short books. I read a few Goosebumps books and things like that. But yeah, quite a wide variety of things. So definitely some trashy stuff, some quite like weird and disturbing horror, some classic crime, and some more kind of literary stuff as well. So quite a few different things to talk about today. 30 books, as I say, so I'm not going to dwell too much on any of the individual books, but I'll try and get through all of them reasonably quickly for you and just give you a flavour of what I read. So what I will do, as I usually do with these videos, I will go through them in the order that I read them, and at the end I'll tell you my book of the month. Right, so I've got the stack on my lap here. We'll see how that goes. That could end up being a bit of a disaster, but let's try it and see. And I've got little post-its for the Kindle books I read, so I don't forget those. So let's start with the first thing I finished this month. That was The Thin Man by Dashiell Hammett, a classic crime novel. I read that for a kind of special project I'm doing, so I'm not going to tell you too much about it because I will be talking about it more in the future. But yes, an interesting classic crime book. It mashes together a load of different stuff. It wasn't quite what I was expecting, but I really enjoyed it. And the central 2 characters, Nick and Nora Charles, who are kind of this married couple. Nick is a detective, or was a detective, but has kind of given up being a detective because he's got married, but gets dragged into investigating this strange case. So yeah, a classic. I'm not sure I can quite see why it was a classic, other than perhaps the fact that Hammett wrote some other classics. But it was a really fun read, and as I say, mashed a load of different stuff together. So yeah, an interesting book. After that, I read for my continuing read-through of Patricia Highsmith's books. EDI Diary. This was fantastic. So definitely more literary feeling than Patricia Highsmith's other books that I've read, which, you know, tend to be thrillers. This is a book about a woman, Edith, and her life. Takes place over several years, decades even, and, you know, talks about her relationship with her husband and her son, and just stuff that happens to her. And it's one of those books that is, like, at times almost unbearably bleak, despite the fact that nothing particularly unusual happens to Edith. There's one thing in this book that you could argue is a bit unusual, but aside from that, it's mostly just about how life can grind you down sometimes. So a really, really excellent book. Very, very moving, beautifully written. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. After that, I read a Goosebumps book for Old School April. That was It Came From Beneath the Sink, of course, by RL Stine. As all the Goosebumps books are, this was very silly, but a lot of fun. So in this one, the heroine, who's like a young girl, finds this sponge under the sink in a new house she and her family move into. The sponge turns out to be alive. Weird stuff happens thereafter. It was silly. It was fun. After that, I read Vinyl Detective Low Action by Andrew Cartmel. So the Vinyl Detective books, a series of books about this guy who finds like lost records for people, and also investigates mysteries, because with every lost record it turns out there's some kind of mystery. In this one, the record he's looking for is by a female punk band called the Blue Tits, and it's like the first pressing of their first album, which quickly got withdrawn and replaced with a slightly different version. So he's trying to track that down, but he's also investigating a series of threats and attacks that have been like perpetrated against members of that band who are now a lot older. So the band had their heyday in like the 70s during the punk era. It's now in the present day, so they're all kind of middle-aged women doing different kinds of things. So just a fun book. The Vinyl Detective books are really, really enjoyable. They've got a great kind of central cast of characters who you come to know and love as you read the series. I had a really good time. A very enjoyable book. I then read The Wind Through the Keyhole by Stephen King for my ongoing read-through of all the Stephen King books I hadn't read. So this is the final, not the final book in the Dark Tower series, the final book in terms of the order in which they released in the Dark Tower series, but actually takes place midway through the series. I've done a video review where I talk about the whole series. This was fun. It was nice to revisit these characters, so I read it after finishing the rest of the series. It has an interesting structure in terms of being a bit like a Russian doll, so there's like a story within a story within a story, and it was fun. The kind of central story, which is the most like fantasy feeling, if you like, was my least favourite. There's a wraparound story which is kind of a bit of a mystery, which was fun, and then you get the kind of the wrapper around the edge of that, which has got the characters you know and love from the Dark Tower series. So an interesting book, a fun read, nice to see King revisiting the universe he created, but like not an amazing book. But if you like the Dark Tower series and you haven't read this one, it's definitely worth reading. After that then, a fantastically gruelling and disturbing horror novel, The Ritual by Adam Nevill. So again, I've done a review of this on the channel. I really, really enjoyed this. So this was our book club pick this month for my Patreon and channel members book club. This is just a really interesting horror book in that it mashes two different styles of horror together. And does it really, really well. So Adam Nevill is a really interesting writer, and I definitely want to read more stuff by him. This one is about a group of guys who had been like friends at university, are now kind of middle-aged and have, you know, very different lives from each other, going on a trip to Scandinavia to kind of hike in the woods, and getting hunted by a mysterious force while they're in the woods. Really, really genuinely creepy at times. Really interesting central character who kind of grows and changes as you read the book. I thought it was a really solid horror novel. Very good indeed. After that, a bit of trash. So I read book... now, which is it? Is it book 20? Oh, no, book 22. Book 22 in the Executioner series by Don Pendleton. This was Hawaiian Hellground. This was really fun. So the Mac Bolan, so Mac Bolan is the hero of this series of books. He is the executioner who's fighting a war against the mafia. In this one, as the title suggests, he goes to Hawaii. But as well as fighting the mafia, he's also fighting this rogue Chinese general. There's loads of action. There's loads of characters from previous books in the series who kind of get brought back in. So it's got a bit of a kind of greatest hits feel to it at times. Just really, really fun. Very silly, but really fun, but some great action sequences. After that, another one of the trashy series that I am kind of reading my way through. This is the Survivalist series by Jerry Ahern. So this was book number 13, Pursuit. So this is like a post-apocalyptic series. In this one, John Rourke, the hero, and his family encounter some Icelandic Vikings and drive around in mini tanks. It was very silly, but it was a lot of fun. Again, lots of action. A reasonably interesting plot. But really, these books are just about kind of the setting and the characters and the fun. And to his credit, Jerry Ahern does a really good job of having kind of continuing storylines through this series. Unlike the Executioner books, which tend to be kind of reasonably standalone, the Survivalist books do have, you know, ongoing story arcs, characters who kind of come and go, and this was another fun entry in the series. After that, some non-fiction. So I read If Chins Could Kill, Confessions of a B-Movie Actor by Bruce Campbell, star of the Evil Dead films. This was just a fun and interesting read. So, a memoir, so it starts with his childhood, but a lot of stuff about, in particular, the making of the first Evil Dead film, how he came to meet Sam Raimi, the director of that film, and other people who were involved in it. And just some really interesting stuff about low-budget filmmaking and what it's like to be involved in a low-budget film. And then kind of later on in the book, what it's like to be like a jobbing actor in Hollywood, trying to get roles, trying to make money. Bruce Campbell, one of those people whose face is recognisable to many of us, but who you wouldn't necessarily say, or you wouldn't have said at this point in his career, which was, this book was published in 2001, he was like hugely successful, so he was having to like fight for roles to pay the bills. So really, really interesting, and he comes across as a really likable guy. There's some very funny anecdotes and things like that in this, and the introduction to this book, which is written by Sam Raimi and Ivan Raimi, his brother, was absolutely hilarious. One of the funniest things I've ever read. It's worth picking up a copy of this book just for that introduction, which was brilliant. After that, another book I've done a review of on the channel that went up very recently. That's The Shadow Glass by Josh Winning. This was really, really entertaining. So the concept of this book is there's a movie director, kind of like Jim Henson, who makes films with like family fantasy films with puppets. And he's died, and his son is kind of going through his effects basically, and going through his film studio, and discovers some of these puppets from his most famous film, The Shadow Glass, which he made in the 80s, and the puppets come to life. So it's got a kind of an immediately appealing concept. I really like the concept of it, which I knew going into it. But it's just fun. It's just a really fun book that feels like an 80s family movie. It just does everything right. It's got nice nice plotting, great characters, bit of humour, a bit of suspense and fantasy, and some scary scenes and things like that. Just a really, really fun read. After that, another fantasy book, but something quite different. This is Solo Leveling by Chugong. So this is a South Korean light novel. So light novels are, kind of reasonably easy reading books, often kind of fantasy books. This one, there's also, as is often the case with light novels, there's also like a manga series and an anime series that tell the same story. So this is about a version of South Korea, which is kind of like actual South Korea, but there are these weird portals that have opened up with kind of dungeons beyond them, and there are groups of people called hunters who go into these dungeons and like fight the monsters in there and get treasure and stuff like that. So this book is what's called a lit RPG, which means it uses concepts from RPGs, both like tabletop role-playing games and also like video role-playing games, as part of the story. And it's kind of difficult to describe that, but basically the characters will have like attribute points, and they will level up as they go, and make decisions about how they want to how they want to use the experience points they've earned by defeating monsters to increase their different attributes and things like that. So in this one, the central character is like the worst hunter ever. He's like the lowest of the low, but for various reasons he becomes able to see his own attribute points and things like that, and like starts leveling up really, really quickly and becomes really powerful. So that's kind of the basic concept, and it was fun. He's an interesting central character. He's a bit of a loser, but it was fun to read. Some really good action sequences. My only problem with this book is it finishes quite abruptly in order to set itself up for the next book in the series. But it was a fun and entertaining read. After that, I read a book by my favourite author, Evan Hunter, although it's definitely not my favourite book of his, but it was good. So it's Strangers When We Meet. So this is a novel he wrote in the 50s. So he wrote both as Evan Hunter and as Ed McBain. As Evan Hunter, he tended to write more kind of general fiction or literary fiction type stuff. As Ed McBain, he tended to write crime fiction. This is a book about affairs, basically, about infidelity. So centering on this guy who's an architect who has an affair with a woman in his neighbourhood, and it's about the impact of that affair on both their lives and on the lives of the people around them. So it was interesting. It was really gripping. You wanted to keep reading to find out what was going to happen. It's always interesting, I think, reading books that were really popular in their day. So this was quite a big hit for Evan Hunter back in the 50s. There was a movie version made of it, which was quite well regarded. But it's a book that's forgotten. It's basically out of print nowadays. It's not a book anyone talks about. So I'd find it interesting reading books like that give you a window into an earlier time. And in this one, for instance, set not long after the end of the First World War, the main character the Second World War. The main character fought in the Second World War, and there's like this reference to a cartoonist who I'd never heard of. and whose name I now forget, but who I looked up, and it was really interesting, like reading about his cartoons and their impact on kind of American society. So they were, you know, he did these little cartoon strips about the lives of soldiers. So often like one panel things with just a bit of humour, but that brought the, you know, what it kind of, not exactly what it was like to be fighting in the Second World War, but to an extent brought the lives of soldiers back to people in America. So it's just a reference to one of those, and I ended up going down a rabbit hole like reading about this guy. So I do find that interesting, and this overall was an interesting and enjoyable book. Really good ending. I thought the ending was excellent. So yeah, another hit from Evan Hunter for me, but yeah, not my favourite of his books. I do tend to prefer his crime fiction. After that, another light novel. This one was sent to me during the month by the publisher, and it looked like it was so much fun, I thought I would read it. So it's Canine Detective Chris, Book 1. The Shibu Inu Detective Tracks Down the Stolen Jewels by Tomoko Tabe. So this is a middle grade detective book about this canine detective, Chris, who is so his real name is Christie, so named after Agatha Christie. Real name. Do dogs have real names? Anyway, his full name is Christie, and he was a police dog, but had to get retired from being a police dog, and has now been adopted by this young boy, and they end up investigating a theft at a local jewellery store, basically. So very silly, very very light, but I enjoyed it. After that, something very different. So I read book 6 in the Witches series by James Darke, The Killing. This was fun. So I also read the 7th book, which I'll talk about in a minute. So this takes the series in a slightly different direction. There's 8 books in the series in total, so we're kind of getting towards the end. So this is a kind of trashy, quite sleazy series of books from the mid-80s that I think were only ever published in the UK. I don't think they were ever published anywhere else. It was fun. It's like full of sex and violence, but the plot is decent. The central character you do kind of root for as he tries to kind of go up against the baddies. So yeah, a fun read. After that, I read an independently published book that was sent to me a while ago by the author. It appears to have been published in paperback in the UK since he sent it to me. It doesn't look like it's out in the States yet, and it doesn't seem to be out on Kindle in either of those territories, so hopefully it will be published on Kindle as well at some point. It was really fun. So the book is called Neon Jezebel, and it's by an author called Zachary Westbrook. It seems to be the first in what's going to be a trilogy of books, and it's kind of a throwback to kind of pulpy fiction of the 30s, in that you've got like the central character is a guy who's like a millionaire playboy type character, but who fights crime as well. And people in this universe, some of them have the ability to like influence people. So he's got this ability to use this thing called the voice to influence people's actions and things like that. He's fought in the First World War and used it in the First World War, so he was part of like an elite group within the military there. And he's now, you know, kind of trying to make a life for himself, trying to run his family company, but ends up getting involved in, kind of mysterious shenanigans and stuff like that as well. So this book had some interesting stuff to say about kind of politics and religion, but also just a ton of action, a bit of spice. It was just a really, really fun read, and I hope Zachary Westbrook continues the series, because I'd definitely like to read more. After that, so the next book in the Witches series, book 7, The Feud. So much the same comments as for the previous one. It was a fun, sleazy read. After that then, another Goosebumps book, The Lizard of Oz. So this is from the Goosebumps Most Wanted series, which is like a more recent series of Goosebumps books, also by RL Stine. But unlike the other book I read, which I think was published in the 90s, I think this was published in like the 2010s. So it's got kind of references to social media and stuff like that. In this one, the main character... her family, so her parents are kind of a bit weird, and they want to start this lizard farm, so they get this lizard egg from Australia, which hatches during the book, and you know, all hell breaks loose as usual in the Goosebumps books. But this one had a really good twist ending as well. I really enjoyed the ending of that one. After that, something a bit heavier, Brainwyrms by Alison Rumfitt. So I really enjoyed Alison Rumfitt's first book, Tell Me I'm Worthless. This one I didn't enjoy quite as much, but it's still interesting. So Alison Rumfitt is a trans woman, so this book very much reflects on, you know, the experience of being trans, and it's a body horror book, and it feels like there's a bit of an overlap there. I think there's something about, you know, body horror books are about your body not being what you want it to be, not behaving in the way you want it to behave. And I think that is, you know, true for trans people who are suffering from kind of body dysmorphia. So an interesting book. Definitely I didn't enjoy it as much as Tell Me I'm Worthless. It's really, really gross at times, and it felt a bit more kind of meandery than Tell Me I'm Worthless. Tell Me I'm Worthless felt like it had a kind of, not exactly a linear plot, but it felt like it was constantly building on the things that had gone before in it, whereas this was a little bit messier, I'd say, but definitely really interesting, and I did enjoy it. After that then, I read a Doc Savage book, so I read book 6 in the Doc Savage series by Kenneth Robeson. This was The Lost Oasis. So Doc Savage, kind of, I guess, one of the books that influenced Neon Jezebel. So Doc Savage is this kind of, he's known as the Man of Bronze, so a kind of superhero type character. The book's originally published in the 30s. He has a gang who kind of help him out with stuff, and in this one, there's like an airship that they're tracking, and the first kind of 2/3 of the book was a bit slow. There's lots of stuff with them just following bad guys around, but you're not really sure what the bad guys are doing. But the end of this book was just fantastic. All sorts of action. I won't tell you what that action was because it will spoil the book, although the cover actually gives you a big clue as to one of the elements. But yeah, just a really, really fun action-packed climax. After that, some more trashy stuff. So I read book 21 in the Edge series by George G. Gilman. So series of westerns from the 70s written by an English guy. This was deeply silly. So George G. Gilman had a habit. So a lot of the Edge books are like quite dark and gritty and stuff like that, but he did throw a lot of humour into them, and sometimes they're very, very silly. So this book kind of recreates the famous Rolling Stones gig where they got the Hells Angels disastrously to do security. It recreates that in like a Western setting. So Edge is going to this music festival. There's this weird group of people who are kind of a bit like monks, who are doing security for the music festival, and it all goes wrong. It was very, very silly, but it was entertaining. After that then, the final Goosebumps book I read this month, that was Shocker on Shock Street. This again was really fun and had a really good twist ending. So this is the book I ended up reading for Giant April because it features a like giant praying mantis. So in this one, the central kid, her dad is like works for this movie company, and she gets to go with a friend of hers on a tour of like a theme park ride that they've set up using special effects from the movies, but the special effects turn out to be real. It was really, really fun, and as I say, had a fantastic twist ending. After that, another kids book, but very different. This was Go Ahead Secret 7 by Enid Blyton. So one of a series of books about a gang of like kid detectives, set in England, written in I think the 50s. In this one, the Secret Seven are investigating a series of like dog nappings, and discover this ring of criminals who are kidnapping people's dogs. It was fun. I used to read these books as a kid, so it was kind of fun and nostalgic to go back to it. And then after that, another kind of small press book, I guess you'd say, from a really interesting publisher called Neotext, who publish a variety of different things. But the stuff I've read for them has been kind of genre fiction, often like novellas or short novels, but with illustrations as well. So they're really nicely done. I think their books are only available on Kindle, but you get like nice illustrations and things like that, as well as the stories. This was quite a dark kind of horror revenge type story, where a group of people in this small town have all turned up murdered, and there turns out to be a terrible secret that unites them, which gives a clue as to the motive for the murders. And there's kind of a supernatural element to this. There's a horror element. There's a crime element. It was a really, really fun read. So that was The Light at the End by Henry G.M. Jones. After that, another kind of trashy crime novel. Well, not another. I think it's the first trashy crime novel I've talked about. This one's actually a trashy crime novel from the 50s. This was The Scrambled YGS by Richard S. Prader, one of the Shell Scott mysteries. So these are kind of like, I suppose, the most obvious or better known character to compare Shell Scott to would be the Mike Hammer books by Mickey Spillane. So a kind of hard-boiled detective who solves crime and beds beautiful women. It's that kind of thing. So really quite cheesy at times, but an enjoyable mystery. Very, very much of its time, but a fun read. And it was nice reading it in this kind of vintage, what is it, gold medal? Yeah, vintage gold medal edition. Okay, we are nearly at the end. I've got a few more books to go. So next up, another Neo textbook. This was called Midnight 99, and it was by an author who on the cover is named Ash X, but inside is called Ashley Christine. This was a weird, very, very, very funny sci-fi book. So the concept is that these two like lizard aliens have come to Earth centuries previously. They're called Doug and Terence, and they kind of, in the background, control human society. The central character of the book is a drug dealer who, among the other drugs she peddles, is one that allows people to see the reality of what's going on. And it's about her interactions with Doug and Terence and their kind of acolytes. So there's kind of like a hierarchy of humans who are supporting our lizard overlords, if you like. Really, really silly, but very funny. One of the funniest books I've read for ages. It really was great. I just thoroughly enjoyed it. And it ends with this weird cliffhanger, which really makes me hope that there's going to be another book in the series. I don't think there is yet, but I really hope they do a follow-up. After that, a book that was sent to me by the author. This was a British crime novel called Courier by an author called Zoe Rossi. So set quite close to me, set in Sussex. I live in Sussex, but set on the other side of Sussex. This was fun. So it's kind of a psychological thriller, I suppose, about a guy who's like an Amazon type courier who delivers to this family's house, and he becomes convinced that the woman is in an abusive relationship, basically, and he becomes obsessed with her and becomes obsessed with the idea of saving her from this relationship, and it kind of spirals from there. But it was not a particularly deep book, but a really enjoyable quick read. I had a good time with it. And then after that, another book that was sent to me by the author. This was NPC by Ben Counter. So this is another lit RPG. This is only available in one place. So Ben Counter is publishing this book to make money for Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières. So I will leave a link in the description to the video to the place where you can buy a copy of this book should you want to. It's kind of one of those pay what you want type deals. This was really fun. So another lit RPG, just really, really entertaining. I thought this did a better job of weaving in that concept of like the kind of video games and things like that into the story than Solo Leveling did. In this one, you follow this guy who's like an NPC, so like a non-player character, so like a minor character in the story, who ends up like having his own agency, and having his own story, basically, which is kind of not what's supposed to happen. And it was just really entertaining. So a fun kind of fantasy story with the kind of stuff you expect in a fantasy story, so treasure and battles and stuff like that, but with this interesting central character who went on like an interesting journey throughout the story. I really, really enjoyed it. And as I say, link in the description should you want to support the charity and buy a copy of it. Next up then, and we are very nearly at the end now, so I'm into the final three. So this was a Harlequin romance, or Mills and Boon as they are in the UK, Brace for Impact by Janice K. Johnson. This was recommended by Sarah from the channel A Bookish Knitter, and it was really fun. So this is a romantic suspense novel. The main female character is someone who's like witnessed a crime. She's being ferried to the trial to give evidence in a like a light plane. The plane crashes. There's a suggestion of foul play. She's marooned in like the mountains, and this hunky ex-military guy who happens to be hiking in the mountains, like finds her basically and saves her from the bad guys, and they fall in love, etc., etc. So really predictable, but just really well done. Genuinely tense at times. Some good kind of not so some action sequences, but also just good kind of peril type sequences where they're up against nature and having to survive, and a nice bit of romance as well. So I enjoyed that a lot. Next up then, Crime Partners by Donald Goines. So Donald Goines, a really successful black crime writer in the States in the 70s. Didn't have a very long career because he died very young and in mysterious circumstances as well. So this is the first of a series of 4 books. He originally published these under a pseudonym, which I think was Al Clark. This was interesting. It was definitely messy in terms of its plot. But the central character, or he's not even really the central character, the character that looms over the story is a guy called Kenyatta, who runs like a paramilitary type organisation who's trying to take down like corrupt cops and things like that. And he is like the linking thing through the other 3 books in the series. But it kind of centres on 2 kind of smaller, less important characters who are drug addicts who are trying to get money, basically. So like really grim and dark at times. In particular, the first 2 chapters were horrific, absolutely horrific, and yeah, a bit messy plot wise. But what Donald Goines does really, really well is give you characters who are interesting to read, who you want to know more about. And he also does a really good job of just portraying the existence of these people, which is, was really grim, and impoverished, basically. So a really interesting book, not necessarily a fun read, but definitely engrossing. So yeah, I don't know if I enjoyed it is the right word, because it is absolutely horrific at times, but definitely interesting, and I do want to read the other books in the series, all of which I've got. And then the final thing I read was a book from Hard Case Crime. This was Brainquake by Samuel Fuller. So Samuel Fuller is a name you may recognise. He was quite a big Hollywood director in kind of the 50s and 60s in particular, I think. I think made films kind of to an extent on the edge of Hollywood, and it ended up making some films that were quite controversial that kind of ended his career, basically. But also wrote a few books. This is a book he wrote in the 90s towards the end of his life, which was really weird and really fun. So it's about this guy who works as a bagman for the mob, so basically ferrying money from one place to another. But he suffers from what he terms brainquakes, which are basically like horrific migraines where he also sees visions. And it's about him getting involved with this woman, and trying to like break away from his life in the mob. So kind of a fairly standard sort of like 50s Hollywood plotline almost. But there's just so much stuff in this book. Some really interesting characters, including like a female mob boss and a female detective, a black female detective who's a really interesting character. And the opening of this book was just absolutely insane. So it features a pram, like a baby's pram, that's been rigged with a gun that the baby can trigger by like pulling on like a toy that's in the pram. And there's also a bomb in the pram underneath the baby, and it's a pressure sensitive bomb. So if you take the baby out, the bomb will explode. Just incredibly tense, this opening sequence, but also completely over the top and bizarre. It was just great. I loved the opening. The book never quite lived up to the promise of the opening, but it was really, really interesting. As I say, all sorts of weird and wonderful characters in it. Definitely a fun and enjoyable and very different kind of a read. So yeah, I do recommend it if you like the sound of it. Anyway, I've rambled on for over half an hour. I was going to try and keep this reasonably short, but I seem to have failed to do that. So if you've watched this far, thank you very much for sticking with me. Wait, hold on. I got to the end and didn't tell you my book of the month. I realised after I'd finished filming, I forgot to mention what my favourite book of the month was. It was, and you may have guessed this when you heard me praise it in the video, it was EDI Diary by Patricia Highsmith. So I've really become a fan of Highsmith through this project of reading all of her books. I really think she's a great kind of thriller writer. But this showed her writing in a different light. It didn't rely on kind of the thriller plots that work so well in most of her books. It was just a pure character study, and it was really, really beautifully done. I really did think it was excellent. I will leave it there, but do let me know what you read in April. Let me know if you've read any of the things I talked about. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.